when we get to the fourth line, we get to perhaps the most unusual of all the profile lines. Unusual in the sense that it is many things. It is many different things, and it connects in different ways. In fact, it's very much an integrating field between the right angle and the left angle. The lower trigram ends here with the 3-6. However, when we get to the 4-6, the 4-6 is still part of what is right angle. It's no longer lower trigram. It actually belongs to the upper trigram, but in fact, it's still right angle. It's very important to understand that what's going on here in the fourth line is that you're having a very powerful transition that's taking place. I showed you about the impact of the 88 degrees of the sun, this movement that actually creates life itself. That there's a certain point, here we see that the 3-5 is going to become a 3-6. Now remember, that's in the last 13% of a line, or the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of a line. Now, of course, what's going to happen is that by the time that this gets to the fourth line, by the time we get to the fourth line, instead of this being a 6, it's going to have to become a 1. And the moment it becomes a 1, what it's doing is that it's leaving one hexagram and it's entering into the next, and we have a complete change in the configuration. Here you can see the right angle structure. So what happens is when we get to the end of the lower trigram, here it is here. That's the 3s and the 6s. Here's a 3-6 profile. This is a changing cross of adaption. Adaption is the keynote of the third line. All right, so crosses within a line. Here are the 245 3s. Crosses within a line, there are two possibilities. There's the foundation cross. This makes up 87% of the line. Remember, a line is 56 minutes and 15 seconds. And then in the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds, you have the changing cross. That's why we have two variations of each. But notice what happens when we get to the fourth line. When we get to the 45-4 in this case, and the 26-4, when we get to the foundation cross, that cross is still this structure. In other words, it's the 45, the 26, the 22, and the 47. But you see, when you get to the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of this fourth line, when you get right down to the end of it, what happens is that that line behind can't be a 6 anymore. There's no place to go. It has to become a 1. It has to move to the next hexagram. So we go from the 22 to the 36, and we go over here from the 47, and we go to the 6. In other words, the 26-45 axis remains the same. But this axis changes. And this is the change that takes place. So the fourth line personality actually has a very, very different unconscious. At one level, it has a right angle unconscious. It's 6 line. It's still in the same configuration of the previous 6 crosses. But at the moment that it switches over, that fourth line personality also hooks up to a whole new cross configuration. And this is the beginning of the movement to the left angle and to the complete transpersonal being. In looking at the lower trigram, we were dealing with, in the right angle, we were dealing with personal destiny. And we talked about how personal destiny is one of the 3 geometries, and that personal destiny is about being self-absorbed in one's process. It does not have strong transpersonal skills. That its connectiveness to the other is always going to be the responsibility of the other in order to open that up. Now, when we get to the end of that right angle process, the beginning of the upper trigram, but the end of the right angle process, we're going to be at the 4-6. Now, the thing to recognize about the 4-6 is that the 4-6 is extremely unusual. It's unusual in that 4-6 is all transpersonal. The fourth line is upper trigram. The sixth line is upper trigram. The assumption is that this is a transpersonal cross. It is not. In other words, it is the completion, it is the finishing of the right angle process. Think about the nature of the fourth line. The fourth line is the capacity to be able to externalize. And it is the capacity to be able to externalize as an opportunity that arises, to be able to grasp that opportunity, and that opportunity is always going to be the result of friendship, or a byproduct of friendship. In other words, that the fourth line has this capacity inherent in it to be able to attract and make friends with the other. Now, we've seen the fourth line at the unconscious level. In other words, we've seen the 1-4 and the 2-4. But there's a big difference between having a profile operating at the unconscious level where you have no access to it and it's basically a surprise, and having it as part of the personality and therefore the overview of the personality and what it's connected to. So the fourth line personality is dynamically involved in finding and making friendships for the sole purpose of being able to externalize its truth. After all, what we're looking at is we're looking at the end of the right angle experience. Now, take a look at the geometry of things, because all of these numbers, because they're part of our logical genetic code and are fundamentally a binary, if you look at them and you look at their commonalities, you'll discover many things. The first thing to look at is look at this base cross that we began with. We began with the 1-3. And look what we're finishing with when we get to the end of the right angle. That's a 4-6. Now the 1 is a harmony to the 4, and the 3 is a harmony to the 6. In other words, that the beginning and the end, they're deeply connected to each other. Everything else is sandwiched in between. It's very important to see that there's this basic harmony. So think about how that works. The 1 to the 4. Well, the 1 is there to establish the foundation, and the 4 is there to externalize the foundation. So the first thing to recognize about a fourth line personality is it's going to be very fixed in the way it externalizes. It is at the end of the right angle process. It's not about to say that the whole right angle process is junk, that we're going to desperately crawl around and look for a new foundation. It is there to be able to externalize that through making friends with others. However, it's even more complex than that. Because whenever you're dealing with the fourth line as a personality, you're always dealing with the deep instability that's there in order to make these transition jumps. That is, that 4-6 is playing out many games at the same time. And the conditioning of that is the sixth line unconscious. We saw in the 1-3 that if the foundation isn't right, that the anarchist is there ready to tear down the foundation and start the process of building a new one. Now the 4-6, that sixth line has to go through its third line theme in the first 28.6 years of its life. So it gets deeply involved. Now, I made a joke yesterday about 4-6s being the profile of the voyeur. They're actually only the voyeur between their Saturn return and their Chiron return. That's when, as a sixth line, they are up on the roof. And because their personality has the capacity to find friends and make friends, they actually become aloof in the social world that they belong to. In other words, that's their way of watching, that's their way of being able to see what's going on and have their objective view from their place on the roof. So in looking at the 4-6, though it has all of these transpersonal potentials, that is, both of those lines being upper trigram, this is still personal destiny. But it is the personal destiny that can impact socially with others. This is a right angle cross that knows how to be with people, knows how to meet people, knows how to integrate with people, knows how to be comfortable with the other. So the 4-6, the behavioral identity is the opportunistic role model. And of course, here you see the capacity that's inherent in the 4-6 is to get to a point when they come down off of the roof, off of their 6th-line unconscious, that they can be the example of the right angle experience. In other words, they're the completion of what personal destiny can be. And they have to be the example of living out their personal destiny. Not only that, what they are doing at the same time is that they are transmitting the foundation of the right angle experience, which is what it means to be both self-involved in this life and yet not be left alone. After all, that's quite a thing to do as well. In terms of the projected attitude, what we have is the abdicator and the administrator underneath. Now remember this whole thing about being an abdicator. That is, the 4th line is interested in making friends so that it can fulfill its personal destiny. And if it sees that it can't fulfill its personal destiny with its friends, in other words, to be able to externalize what it is without conflict, without disturbance, without resistance, then it's going to abdicate. For example, you have somebody who's a 4th line and they insist that the world is flat. Now, they're looking for friends who will agree with them. Yeah, I think it's flat too. Then everything's fine. But the moment that they're dealing with people who say, no, that's not true, it's round, let me show you pictures, that's the moment they abdicate. And in that moment of abdicating, what they may actually do is that they may actually simply let the other person have their moment and pull away. But it doesn't mean that they're going to think that the world is round. They're going to walk away thinking that the world is still flat. And, only if they go around the world and not fall off the edge will they be able finally to be able to make, that transition for themselves. In other words, it's very important to see that their being fixed has tremendous influential capacity. All 4th lines have the keynote of being influential. They are influential in that they do stay with their thing. They're not easily swayed from what they see or what they understand or what they feel is correct for them. Underneath, of course, you have the administrator. And this is the whole thing about what happens to the 4-6 once it gets through the turmoil of just making friends and breaking the bonds. Remember that in the first 28 years of its life approximately, it's going to live out an actual 4-3 theme. In other words, the unconscious is going to be living out its 3rd line, out of the 6th line, its 3rd line experience in the first Saturn return. So they make friends and then they break those bonds. And they make friends and then they break those bonds. They become very pessimistic about whether friendship is ever something that can really be there for them in their lives. They know they can be friendly, but whether they can maintain friendship, whether friendship can live up to their ideal, because they're a 6th line unconscious. At the unconscious level, all 6 lines are idealists. They want perfection. They want to be the role model. They want to be the example. So they have this early pessimism in relationship to friendship. The other thing is that because it's a 4th line personality and because it's the opportunist, if it doesn't live out the opportunist mantra, don't leave a lover until you have another lover, don't leave your friend till you have another friend, don't leave your job till you have another job, then of course each time that they jump out of something, break that bond driven by the unconscious, they won't be comfortable with it. They may have real difficulty in finding another friendship that may be of value to them. After all, they are opportunists. But when they get to that point of climbing up onto the roof, when they get into their voyeur stage, that voyeur stage is part of a healing process for them. They disengage from the intensity of what relationships have brought them in their first 30 years. And yet at the same time, because they're a 4th line personality, they're not going to be able to escape being social and being socially integrated. The difference is that they become less connected in that social integration. They find their place on a moving roof. You know, their house is a mobile home. You know, they're up there on the roof and it's moving around through the social venue that they go through, but it's very different for them in that stage. It also means, like all 6 lines, that the moment that they crawl up onto the roof is the moment they begin to get their authority. In other words, it's the moment, career-wise, you can always tell a 6-line person, to really understand that they're not going to be able to make the kind of money that they would like to make in this life until they get past their Saturn return. Because it's only after their Saturn return that they begin to get the authority, and out of that authority begin to get their value in return for the energy that they put out. And of course, many 6 lines become deeply disillusioned in their 3rd line, first Saturn return phase, because they don't think that they can find a career or something that is consistent for them that's really going to be able to provide for them in the way they want. Yet the moment they go up onto the roof, that's my point about why it's so difficult for people to come off the roof, is that, in disengaging from the chaotic first cycle and going up onto the roof and finding your authority, finding a certain level of affluence, beginning to feel good about yourself because of the way in which other people see you, that's not such an easy thing to leave behind afterwards. So what happens for the 4-6 is that in that time of being aloof until their Chiron return, where they're approximately 50 or 51, basically what they're doing is that they're living out their administrator role. In other words, they are administrating to others. They're providing them as a friend. They're providing them with direction. Now, this is one of the dilemmas for the 4-6s, is that until they understand that that's part of their purpose in life, they won't ever treat it the way it should be, which is professionally. In other words, this is not about allowing everybody that knows you to drain you for your administrative capacity. And one of the dangers for all 4th line personalities is because they have a large cross-section of friendships that they develop, they can end up literally being a place of absorption in which other people are just pulling stuff out of them. That's particularly true with the 4-6 because the 4-6 is there to externalize. It is there to put things out, and of course they do get people who respond to that. So as they watch from their aloofness amongst their friends, that's where they have their strongest administrative capacity. The limited perspective is about fatigue. And of course, this is one of the real dilemmas of the 4-6, and it's why when they're up on the roof, they can be very aloof and withdrawn. We have many ways now. I mean, I love email. I hate the telephone. I've always hated the telephone. You got to make small talk, Email is wonderful. You can just deliver it. In this day and age, there are so many ways in which we can maintain social interaction. And it's particularly important for 4th lines, particularly the 4-6, to recognize that it does not have to spend all of its time involved in person-to-person, aura-to-aura interaction. That there are other ways to maintain a network of associations, whether that is phone, fax, mail, however you do all of that. There are other possibilities. Because the reality is that all 4th lines will suffer from people fatigue. They all do. It's only natural. Their personality is always demanding that friendship as a basis of interaction. And as such, they end up with the pressure of maintaining so many friendships. It can be very draining. And of course, that is unhealthy. So it's one of the things to recognize that it's a real signpost for the 4th line that the moment that they're tired of their social interaction, it does not mean they stop their social interaction. They have to find a way in which they lessen the actual physical contact to others so that they take the burden off of their aura. Then they won't find that they're so fatigued anymore. The other side of that, of course, is the eternal beauty of the 6th line. That is the beauty of being an optimist, what it means to be an optimist in this world. And it is their optimism that leads to the capacity of transition. After all, this is the sixth line responsibility in the harmony of what profile is. They bring us to points of transition. They lead us to the next stage. And you can see that the 4-6 is the end of a process. It's the end of the right angle process. It's the end of the personal destiny process. But it's not yet going to be transpersonal. In other words, when it takes its next step, it's still going to be personal in a way, but it's on its way to the transpersonal process. This optimism is what guides all of us, is that the recognition that there is more, that it is going to continue, that life will continue, that if we can't make the jump from the sixth line to the first line, we're all dead. Literally, it's a dead-end street and everything stops. So it's part of the continuity of life that we have these places of transition. That's why it's so important for all of us to recognize that we all have this opportunity to live out that transition point as a new way of approaching life. That is, to understand that we have themes now that are there for us. The Pyrrhonian theme that is there for us to be able to open up a perspective on what is in front of us, what kind of dynamic theme is ahead of us, and to provide us with the optimism that this is not an ending point in our process, but is a transition point to another process, to a real evolution in that sense, to live it out in our lifetime rather than dying out to our Uranus opposition theme. The aspired to role. It's one of those things about the irony of being a fourth line person. You got this great, delicious personality. Hey, fourth line people, see fourth line personalities, they are some of the most ingratiating people you'll ever meet. They're very warm. They really have the ability to be able to pull you in. And friendship seems very natural to them, not contrived. And of course, at the same time, when you look at their aspired to role, it's aloneness. There's a real irony in all of that. They say, well, yes, come, but please leave me alone. That's a very funny thing to live with. And of course, if you don't know that about yourself, because that's their protection from the fatigue, you have to see that all fits together. In other words, they have to have a mechanism inside of them that says, please leave me alone. For example, if you meet a fourth line person that has any of the gates of aloneness in terms of human design, whether they have the 20th gate or the 40th gate or the 33rd gate, then you're going to see right away that they really know how to take that aloneness, how to take those times for aloneness. But you see, there is that tremendous pressure on them. They need to have a safety valve that says, wait a minute, don't overload me. Underneath that, of course, is their real direction, and their real direction is creativity. I mean, this is a creative profile. It's objectivity, not creativity. The whole nature of the sixth line is to get to a point in which, through its disengagement, through being able to get up onto the roof, that it actually becomes objective. And it's one of the things to see very clearly about, we've got 12 profiles. We have 3 profiles that are going to involve the 6, and only in that point in those lives between 28 and 50 approximately are we going to ever have any objectivity. It says something about what it is to be a human being, how subjective and relative our process is. And as such, how important it is to have that objectivity available. My whole point is that if you don't know your design and you're not entering into things correctly, the third line themes that you're going to live out in your youth are going to distort your perspective through the heightening of your pessimism and may not lead to the kind of objectivity that we can all benefit from. After all, 6 lines represent our role models. They are the ones that establish for us what is possible as the living example, not as philosophy, not as concept or teaching, not as advice or guidance, but simply by their being what they are, by being the living example. You know, that's what we seek out. That is what is the most impressive to all of us, is to be able to see those who live by their word, to see those who are truly themselves, and to finally be able to see human beings in which it is natural for us to trust them. You see, when you think about the nature of trust, only the sixth line carries this as a quality. So the sixth line is there, given its, why do you think they crawl up on the roof? They don't want to take that burden. I mean, you ask a sixth line if it wants to take that burden. They'll say, no, I'm fine up here on the roof, leave me alone. I don't want to go down there and take that burden of responsibility. It is a responsibility. To actually be the example. So this objectivity is something that is very important for us. And of course, when the 4-6 is in that interregnum between the Saturn return and the Chiron return, that's the time for us to really seek out their wisdom. That's the time in which we're really going to be able to have an objective view. But you see, for them to finish their life, after all, that period in their life is only a matter of service. I mean, they're disconnected. They pay a price for being aloof. And then they put out all of that, everywhere else. They have to come back inside. They have to live it out themselves. And that whole objectivity and that role of being objective for everyone has to become their subjectivity, but not subjectivity in terms of how they see, but the subjectivity in terms of their uniqueness and how they will be. That's very different. In other words, instead of looking and seeing the objective field, they have to become a unique aspect within the whole. We all are subjective. We all are relative within the spectrum. And the beauty of all sixes is if we line them all up and we watch them all at work, if they were all living out their design, we would see the objective truth through all of them together, living it out. And then we would all have our correct examples. After all, that's the ideal. When everybody says, let's have peace on earth, let's have this, let's have that, blah, 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 blah. Unless all the sixes are setting the right example, that's their burden. Then we're not going to get to that point. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that it is up to them in the sense that they have to stand alone with that on their shoulders, because I can hear all the sixes crying, why me, poor me. In the next life, I want to be a 1-3, save me all that. You're 1-3, that's it. Okay, next time. We're all connected. I want you to understand the beauty of what it means to be part of a larger thing, a larger entity. We're aspects of a whole. Each of us carry our design, each of us carry our profiles. Now, profiles interconnect with each other in the pattern that I've shown you. In other words, this movement of the 1-3 going to the 6-3. And yet we live that in the world all the time. And we're constantly moving the information in a living genetic code as we interact with each other. You're a 2-4, you go into the supermarket and there's a 2-5 that you pass in the alleyway. You have no idea what kind of information moves in all of that. It's all going on a level deep, deep, deep beneath the surface. And yet all of us are living out this living genetic code all the time. We're all interconnecting to each other all the time. Nobody is in any place alone in all of this. And what ultimately leads to the objectivity of the six is created by the experiential realm that they go through in those first 30 years, interconnecting to the rest of us. We're all part of the process. We're all part of a living genetic continuity. And it doesn't stop with our bodies. It moves through our auras. It moves through that mechanism. I don't know if you saw this. I don't know who put it out. Geo, I think, in Europe. I think it was also maybe National Geographic here, one of these things. There was this photographic sequence You see some man lying on a blanket on a grassy knoll in Chicago, and you see a picture of him from like 5 feet above him, and then you see a picture from 200 feet, and so forth and so on. You keep on going up and up and up and up and up. And it's an incredible thing. It's a simple thing, but it's an incredible thing. The further you move away from this planet, the smaller everything gets, the more compressed everything gets. We live in an illusion. We live in this illusion that there's all this separateness and there's all this space, but it's just an illusion. If you go up high enough, we're all stuck together and squashed. If you rip off this roof and you take a picture from high enough, we're all just squashed together. And you eventually go high enough, we're so squashed you don't even see us anymore. We're gone. And we have this illusion that, that we're all separate and we're all this and blah, blah, blah. And we all got our own problems and we're all special and, blah, blah, blah. And we're squashed together in this dynamic genetic game. So when you're looking at this, don't just see it as abstract numbers, because it's so important to understand that this is alive. We're a genetic matrix, and that genetic matrix is alive, and we're living it out all the time. Right? The bonding strategy. When you get to the bonding strategy, the fourth line deals with the confidant or not. And as we've seen, remember how difficult this is for the child. If you're a 4-6 when you're a child, you're really a 4-3. So what that means is that at the unconscious level, you've got a theme of bonds made and broken rather than soulmate or not. So, of course, what happens to you is that you begin by naturally being attractive to others in terms of your friendship capacity. But that part of you that says, leave me alone, that part of you resonates to that unconscious third line theme. In other words, it makes it very easy to break the bonds. So this is a child that has a different best friend every other day. In other words, they can go to school and they can go through all kinds of different relationships. And of course, breaking the bonds of those relationships, something inside of it that they're not finding. And again, remember what happens to them. Because it's fourth line, because it's opportunist, if they don't wait to make the new friend, if they just leave one friend behind, it's going to get more and more difficult as they go along to actually build a friendship with anyone, even though they're attractive to the other. So they go through this theme, and of course the third line theme at the unconscious level is pessimism, not the optimism of the sixth line. Remember that all 6 lines go through this transition in their life from being inherently pessimistic in the first 30 years to finally finding their optimism. And of course, again, their optimism comes from the moment of disengagement, so they have that opportunity to be able to see that there are possibilities, that they're out of the morass. But the 4-3 child is deep in the morass. So this confidant or not, what happens to them is that they end up making a friend, they end up being the confidant, the bond is broken, and then whatever they said to that friend can get carried in the wind around them. In other words, basically what happens is that they can end up with a lot of negative energy focused on them. Because you see, they are inherently attractive. You want to make friends with a fourth line. You just do. It's a natural thing. Remember, our auras do the talking. A fourth line person puts their aura inside of you. They automatically open you up to friendship. Automatically. So you have a lot of disappointed people with the 4-6 when they're young because they don't get the kind of bonding in that friendship that they expect. And that 4-3, in that stage of its life, it will quickly break a bond when it doesn't get its opportunities soon enough. Those opportunities begin with, after all, as a 4-6, what they want to be able to do is they want to be able to externalize the foundation. My mother says, my father says as a child, they want to get the foundation out. This is the way things are, they will say. And yet at the same time, they will discover that there is resistance with others. After all, the third line will bring people into their lives that aren't necessarily the right kinds of friends for them. This is a bumping into theme. And they will be challenged in terms of what their authority really is. They're going to be challenged in what's fixed in them. And they're not going to like that. Their response to that is, leave me alone and break the bond. But it also creates a pessimism at the unconscious level that they become uncomfortable with what that foundation really is. They become uncomfortable with whether or not that foundation is really secure. Remember, in those first 30 years, at the unconscious level, they're an anarchist. At the unconscious level, they're really ready, to tear things down. And for a 4-6, that can be devastating. A lot of 4-6s crawl to the roof of the house feeling empty. Empty. It is a 4-6 quality. They can be so disappointed through that 4-3 experience that they just crawl up just feeling empty, that nothing is really there for them. It changes, and it changes the moment that they get to their post-Saturn return. Because in the post-Saturn return, you return, when they crawl up onto the roof of the house, they come to their 6th-line theme. And of course, the 6th-line theme is the soulmate or not. Now think about what happens to any 6th line in that phase when it's looking sexually at intimacy with others. All 6 lines have this process in which, because they've disconnected, they're looking out around them to see if there is anyone who has a good relationship. You will find that 6 lines will end up having affairs with, their friends or their friend's lover. Because they will notice after years of being friends, 4-6, being aloof, 6th line, observing, that their friends have a great relationship. And that, that would be a nice relationship for them to have. So they finally see, at that level that's interesting, and it's a classic 6th line to say, well, I would really like that. And of course, out of that friendship comes, your wife makes love to your best friend, or your husband makes love to your best friend, and so forth and so on. It's a very common phenomena. And it is a particular phenomena of the 6th line, because while they're not engaged, that part of them that is idealistic is looking out there for what a soulmate could be. And remember that they are born to know what doesn't work. When they see something that does work, it's incredibly attractive to them. So the nature of the 4-6 can be a real dilemma. After all, the 4 personality cannot have intimacy until they've had friendship first. That's the first thing. That's the only way that that's ever going to work. So they have to have the friendship first. And of course, what we've seen is in the first 30 years, they learn to be pessimistic about friendship, that it really isn't something that necessarily works, and they may not have discovered that friendship leads to sexual intimacy, but instead have simply lived out its frustration. The moment that they go up onto the roof of the house, their friendship opens them up to that possibility, but they're already aloof. And then what they're looking for is they're looking for what's perfect. And they will wait. And it doesn't mean, they get to a point where they assume it will never happen to them. I mean, this is classic 6th line. You see, the only way they can keep themselves disengaged is by reminding themselves that things don't work. And by reminding themselves that things don't work, they can see very clearly, no, there's no such thing as a soulmate out there. It doesn't work for anybody else. There's no reason for me to think that it's going to work for me. It's part of the way in which they keep themselves from having to deal with that. So imagine the dilemma for the 4-6 when it has to enter back into the world. It's got to come down off the roof. It has to do that, because if it doesn't do that, we don't get to juxtaposition. In other words, we don't get to the transition to the transpersonal. So in that moment, when they get up there to the coming down off of the roof, and they come down off of the ladder, then they have to re-engage in relationship. And they have to re-engage in relationship as an example themselves. In other words, at a spiritual level, for them to see that all relationships, when you are clear and you are yourself, all relationships are soulmate relationships. All relationships are perfect. All relationships are exactly what we should expect them to be. In other words, at the moment you enter in clearly yourself, you discover that it is a myth that there is a special combination. It's a myth. All of us can have deep and enriching relationships with each other. They don't all have to be sexual. They don't all have to be deeply intimate, but they can all be clean. And in being clean, we can appreciate what it is to be humans together, which is what it's all about. To eliminate the resistance between us. To be able to see each and every one of us as members of the same blood type, blood field, this genetic grouping that we call humanity. That's the real soulmate. After all, we're all in this together. And we actually all belong to the same body. So it's kind of funny to assume, that we're going to have to need some special combination in all of that. We are all the special combination. Finally, the security strategy. Now, we've seen that the business of being a fourth line is that you're either going to be the benefactor or you're going to be the dependent. This is the nature of the fourth line. And it's one of the things to be clear that if you have fourth line in your life, if you have fourth line children, that you have to be ready to make an extended commitment to them. They aren't necessarily going to get the opportunities when you think they should. That the real opportunities that can happen for them in their life may not be on your timetable. You're 18, get out and go to, get a job. In other words, you really have to see that the moment that you have a fourth line child, you have a different kind of commitment because you have to deal with their dependency. But recognize something. If you don't resist their dependency, this is about not resisting what people are. If you don't resist their dependency, if you don't see that dependency is using you, taking advantage, all of these things that we like to do because we don't understand, so we create all this language and reason, is that those fourth lines that are properly honored in their dependency, they will not stay that way all their life, and when they do become self-sufficient, they are great benefactors. You see, they understand the value of having a benefactor. After all, that's how it begins. And they can be deeply, deeply generous of spirit because of that. Now remember something. Most fourth-line children, by the time they are teenagers, already have parents who want to push them out the door. They do. They do. You see, it is in their profile to be alone, and their parents wish they would be. And so what happens to them is that they get this enormous pressure on them. And of course, they get this pressure at the time in their life. You take a 4-6, in that first 30 years, all that chaos, go out there and do, it's not for them. So it's very important that parents understand this, that they understand that they're going to have to deal with dependency. And for any of you that have a fourth line in your profile, for you to look back and see whether or not you had a valued benefactor in your process. Because, of course, it will tell you so much about where you are right now. We have a lot of people in this life who are very tight. And it's one of the things to recognize about the fourth line. It can bring out through its fixedness this tightness. And unless it's been treated properly when it's young, unless it's been given the privilege of having a benefactor that recognizes its need for that it can end up being tight and tight with everything, tight with money and tight with love and tight with everything else. Because it never had the opportunity to complete its process. Because after all, when they do become benefactors, they're the other side. They can be so generous, both of spirit and material, They can become great philanthropists. They can really be benefactors to society and to other people. They're the ones that form the foundations. They're the ones that open up those opportunities for other human beings. But you can imagine that a lot of them are really given the privilege of that because, of course, if these children had been born with this profile 200 years ago, their dependency time would have been around 13 years. In other words, for parents of that era, it was no big deal. At 13, it was okay. Go to work. By 13, male or female, they were already, bonded together. They may already be living together, and they go out and they do their thing. But we now live in an Uranian cycle. Since the discovery of Herschel of Uranus in 1781, we are part of an Uranian cycle. And what that means is that our half-life point is no longer 15, but it's basically 40. So instead of having kids in guilds learning things from 8 to 13, now we have people in university until 30. The dependency time frame has changed.